Okay. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to JWA's Book Talks. I'm Judith Rosenbaum of the Jewish Women's Archive. Very happy to be with you tonight, today, whatever this is. Please say hello in the chat box. Make sure to chat to everyone. We love to know who is with us. Add your questions in the chat box, and I'll try to bring them in later in the program. Um, a few words about JWA for anyone who is new. We are a digital archive that works to expand and transform the way that we understand history and Jewish culture by documenting and sharing Jewish women's stories. We also pay special attention to how gender functions in the past and present, and we do all of this work because we believe that uncovering a more diverse and nuanced story will help us create a better world. So we welcome your partnership in that. Sorry, I keep looking to the side, but my dog seems to be causing trouble today. Um, yeah. The book talks are just one aspect of JWA's work. I welcome you to check out jwa.org and explore the full range of programs and resources that we offer. Um, and there's a quick logistical note. If you would like captioning, click the button at the bottom of your screen that should say CC or show captions, and that will turn them on for you. For you. I'm very delighted to welcome, actually, it's really welcome back. Our featured author for today, Tova Mirvis, is the author of the newly published novel We Would Never, which we'll be talking about today. She's also the nationally best-selling author of three previous novels, The Ladies' Auxiliary, The Outside World, and Visible City. Her memoir, The Book of Separation, was a New York Times Book Review Editor's Choice and was excerpted in the New York Times Modern Love column. Her essays have appeared in many publications, including the New York Times, the Washington Post, the Boston Globe Magazine, Real Simple, Psychology Today, and her fiction has been broadcast on NPR. She lives in Newton, Mass. With her family, which is also where I live. So Tova and I get to hang out together. Welcome back, Tova.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here. We were just reminiscing about the fact that the first time I was here was about a week into the pandemic, and I think it was the very first of these. And we were all excited that we could do a talk in our pajamas from our homes
It was
without
crazy.
any idea of how long it would be.
It was March 19th, 2020, with Rachel Kadish, and you guys kicked off this whole series of programs, which we originally had planned to do, I think, three. And
Who
now it's
knew?
5 years later. We have done,
Right.
I think, close to 200 or something like that at this point.
Wow.
Continuing strong for more than 5 years. So thank you for kicking us off on a good note and very excited to have you back.
Thank you. It's so nice to be here.
So I am very lucky that I've gotten to hear about this book as over the years as you were writing it and developing. But tell us a little bit about how you came to this gripping story.
Sure. I mean, in so many ways, this was not a book I ever imagined I would write or that I thought fit into sort of the things I am interested in as a writer. But I guess about 10 years ago, I was on Facebook and saw that someone who I knew very, very tangentially, and Judith, I know you knew as well, had been murdered. And I was, horrified, as we all were, of course, and also really curious to know what had happened. I mean, it just seemed like a very shocking thing. And so I began just Googling the story, and I saw that this man who was a law professor at Florida State had been shot and killed. And there was a lot of speculation early on in all the sort of news articles that started coming out as to what might have happened. And there were thoughts that maybe it was a student or a colleague. And then one of the lines in one of the articles I read said that he had been in the middle of a very contentious divorce. And I think that line hit me in my own personal sort of vulnerable spot because I was on the end of a very contentious divorce. And I felt like that was probably where this, sort of the bleeding wound, the heart of this story lay. And I really never thought I was going to write about it. I really mostly would read about it when I was procrastinating from what I was writing about. I was trying to write a novel. I was working on my memoir, and then I started writing a different novel about the old house that you can see a little bit of that Timothy Leary lived in, our house that Timothy Leary lived in for a year. And I thought that was kind of interesting, but every time I tried to write that Leary novel, I just wasn't interested. I don't think it had that sort of friction, like that match striking, that vulnerable part of yourself. And I just kept coming back to this story, and it wasn't really the legal details or the police investigation that captured me. It was this question of, how could such a story happen? And over the years, the ex-wife's family was implicated, a nice Jewish family of dentists in South Florida. And it felt close to home. It didn't feel like a story that happened miles and miles from my own world. And I think I was just so fascinated or felt this urge to understand, how a family could become so unraveled. How do seemingly ordinary people do something so unimaginable? And I felt like fiction was really the only way to answer those kind of questions.
Um, how did you figure out that relationship between the story ripped from the headlines kind of story and make it your own? Like, what was the process of figuring out how do you take this inspiration that you were reading about and turn it into fiction?
Okay, well, in so many ways, I think so much of it was my interest as a novelist stemmed from my frustration with sort of true crime coverage. I felt like it was, it's sort of amazing what you can get if you really set your mind to it. If you read every comment on every YouTube video, you can learn a lot about the story and speculation. There was a Dateline special, a podcast, and I think what was so striking to me was that these news stories, especially in the like tabloid world, never tell you the heart of the story. They tell you sort of the externals, the surface facts, the well, they seem nice or he seemed like a loner, these like little phrases, but they never get that depth. They don't because they can't go inside. They can't go inside people's heads and minds. They can't answer the question of what makes you do this? Or what do you think about the night before you do something you never thought you could do? Or what do you think about the day after? Or what's the conversation? What are those inner wrestlings? And that's the part that I, as a novelist, am interested in. In so many ways, I feel like as much as this book feels like such a different book for me, it's really the same thing. I'm always interested in what people really do on the inside, like who we are on the outside and who we are in our own private, complicated places. And so, in so many ways, like there's a murder and it has like a plot, which is different than my other books, or it has a plotty kind of plot. But I felt like what I needed to do to understand this story was to separate myself from sort of the tabloid coverage, sort of the rip from the headline, sensationalist part, and back up. Because I think what is so interesting to me about true crime in general is, we see true crime stories at the moment when things have veered off the rails, when families are in crisis, when things have gone so far into this land of extremes. But if you rewind these stories, a few months or a few years, they're just stories about families, they're relationship stories, they're stories about everyday people. And that's, I think, the scariest part about them, that they're not about monsters, about psychopaths necessarily. They're about people who find themselves in crazy situations or who are pushed over edges or who come undone. And that's the part that I had to enter into. And that was the part that I had to create because that did not exist in the sort of the coverage of the story.
Hmm. Yeah, right. It's like the part that you're always longing to kind of see behind the curtain or to see what
Right.
led up to something. And there can only be kind
Right.
of supposition about that.
Right. In so many ways, people talk about why we love true crime or like, do we love it because it lets us see danger? Or there's, a theory that women in particular love true crime because there's the idea that if we follow every single bit of this story, we'll somehow know how to keep ourselves safe.
Mm.
And, for me, I think that I'm interested in those ideas. I think for me, it's the feeling that you get to see like how something could have played out, that it's like the stories that are the most compelling to me, the ones that I do go down the rabbit hole, are the ones that start pretty ordinary, where you feel like, oh, it's let's say this story, it's a divorce. I've been divorced. Many of us have been divorced, and you feel like, okay, like how different is my divorce from this? Am I separated from this terrible story by inches or by miles? And that's what pulls me. Or I only recently have gone down the rabbit hole of the Karen Reed story, which is a big Boston story. And I think what fascinates me about that story is I won't give you the summary. It's too long and involved. For those of you who don't know, it's one of those stories. You could Google it, but someone is lying. Someone is either railroading someone, framing someone, or lying. And that idea that you could be accused of something you didn't do, that someone you thought was your friend could lie about you, like that's scary to me. That's the piece that I think keeps us coming back for more and more to that story and to these kind of stories.
Yeah, and there's also, part of I think what you play with also is that like most of the time when these terrible things happen, of course, these are not things that most people would do, but they are things that cross the mind of people sometimes, right? Like it is probably not uncommon for people going through divorce to fantasize about the other person just disappearing and not having to deal with them. But then, you know, how do you get from that place to actually making something happen as opposed to just thinking about it or wishing it would happen in some kind of very unreal way?
Right, that question, I mean, that was the question that I think it haunted me in a certain way, that sense of, how do you go from joking it, saying it, or wishing, even in your mind, having an angry thought or a moment, but how does someone actually do it? And I think what was so disturbing to me about watching this real story is that it wasn't, in the real story, I'll give a little recap. The Adelson family were dentists, as I said, in South Florida, were convicted. One was convicted, one is about to be on trial, two members of the family, of hiring a hitman to shoot their daughter's ex-husband. And he was killed in Tallahassee, and the case dragged on for many years. And at first, three people who were the hitmen were arrested and convicted, and then the brother in the family was arrested and convicted. And right now, Donna Adelson, who's sort of the mother, the kind of the center of this family, is awaiting trial right now as well. And I think that what was so, I think, so haunting and so upsetting about this story is, you feel like, how do you, exactly what I said, how do you not just make the joke, but how do you do it and continue to do it? It wasn't in, the heat of a moment. It wasn't like a crime of passion where you think someone loses control. It took planning, and it happened over many, many months and years. And I think the thing that was so shocking to me about the story that I tried to sort of bring into the novel was no one turns back. What prevents people from saying, like, almost waking up from like a fever dream and saying, like, oh my gosh, this is a terrible idea. Or like,
What are we
what,
thinking?
what are we thinking? We would never do so. We could never. Or we came, like, how could we go through such a thing? And that idea, and one of the ways I really tried to understand it was I thought a lot about the theme of forgiveness. I felt like that was what was so lacking in that story, and that I've used in the book as a theme to run through the novel is, what happens when people are unwilling to forgive, to soften in any way. And I was interested not just, on the impact that it has on the person you don't forgive, but the impact it has on your own self, like what it does to your inner being or your soul if you're unwilling to back down ever. And that was sort of one way in creating the characters and the relationships. I sort of used that as a theme throughout to ask myself, who can forgive here and who can't? And what are the repercussions of that being unwilling to forgive? And who wants to try to forgive? Who is able to sort of ask questions about forgiveness? And it was just sort of like one of the metrics I used in some ways to think about all the character dynamics.
Right, because there's so much, there's sort of the small lack of forgiveness in relationships, and then the much bigger ways of doing something really unimaginably horrible. And you kind of ask that question of like, is it possible? Is it warranted? What happens, as you're saying, if you can't get to that place?
Right. And I was interested also in, the idea, the word never was really, I feel like never in so many ways is the opposite of forgiveness, the sense that I will never. But I was also, that they'll never forgive. One of the central themes of the book is a child who's estranged from his parents who will not forgive them. And the word never, though, I guess was, made it into the title, because I felt like it was also this sort of this the unimaginable, where I felt like, I think all of us, I'd like to think all of us would say that we would never do such a thing. And I think I really do believe I would never be capable of such a thing. And yet I was really interested in the ways that, I don't think we always know what we're capable of in situations that we cannot imagine, in situations that we would never want to find ourselves in, especially when it comes to our children. I thought about the way that, when it comes to our children, the way it's so possible to be that sort of protective. My child always jokes like my inner mama bear comes out. This like, I'm like, who did it? Who did it to you? Just it brings up that feeling so quickly. And, as much as I felt like they did something so unimaginable, I also wanted to ask that question of, what are we, do we know? Do we always know for sure what we could do? Or, how well can we say with certainty, I would never do such a thing? We don't know what is going to happen. We don't know what life has in store for us. And I think that idea was, one of the other things that was so important to me in writing the book.
So maybe this is a good time for you to read that the
Sure.
excerpt that you're going to read, which connects to that theme of forgiveness.
Sure. So I'm going to read it. It's a little late in the book, but they're not going to be spoilers. I don't know if everyone's read the book. I think about the first weeks when the book came out, I did an event in Boynton Beach, Florida. And the first question, someone raised your hand and said, now that we all know the ending, and there was a plot twist here, which was a new experience for me as a writer, and sort of blurted out the ending, and the whole room just like was like, so I'm not going to read plot twist. No spoilers here, but I am going to read. It doesn't give anything away to tell you that my main character, one of my main characters, Sherry Marcus, who is the mother in the family whose daughter is getting divorced, who escal her anger at the situation escalates over the course of this book, and there's a question about whether they are going to whether they are going to, as in the real story, hire a hitman. And I'm going to read you a part that takes place as that real wrestling is taking place, and it takes place. As I said, I was interested in forgiveness, and so as a Jewish writer, Yom Kippur obviously was very much on my mind. And so this is good. This takes place on Yom Kippur. Tonight, Tuesday night was the start of Yom Kippur, and for the first time, Sherry was tempted not to go. How could she sit there, given what she might do? Services were at sundown, and an hour before she was still undecided. What would it mean to miss this year of all years? It would be one more reminder that she had already lost so many parts of herself. She had left in just enough time. The sanctuary was filled when she arrived. They had seats purchased and assigned for the high holidays, but Sherry found an empty spot in the back where she sat alone. Was it her imagination that people avoided looking at her, as if they could feel her secret radiating from her? She looked into the prayer book, wanting the words to hold her aloft. For so many years prior, the prayers had risen inside her, casings that held her sorrows, her hopes. Could she somehow draw a line from who she had been then to who she had become? Could the prayers cleanse her and return her to those earlier days? She tried, but all she could see was Jonah's name inscribed on every page. The thought felt nearly unbearable. He had no idea what might befall him. Squeezing her fingers into fists, she beat her chest along with everyone else as she recited the confessional prayers for the sin of gossip, for the sin of slander. But how could she confess the kind of transgression she considered committing? Surely the prayers had no room for one of this magnitude. Even if people here had deeds hidden in the chambers of their hearts, none could possibly be as grave as hers. She remembered something she learned as a child in a synagogue class long ago. For certain sins, your soul was cut off, untethered. It would endlessly wander, never finding respite. At the time, she'd wondered what deeds were so bad you could never come home. But now she understood. You could be cut off not just from those around you, but from your own self. I'll stop.
Mm. Sherry is a very complicated and not always likable character. She's, as you said, the kind of Jewish mother, and I'm curious with how you grappled with that. The Jewish mother has so much weight in the
Mhm.
literature,
Yeah.
and it's so hard to know how do you represent someone that plays with that stereotype but doesn't reinforce it. How did you work through that?
Well, it's something that I thought, I feel like anytime someone says to me, "Did you worry about this when you were writing?" I feel like the book took about 6 years to write, right on that little couch right behind me. So I feel like I had time to worry about every single thing you could imagine. Like any question of "Did you worry about?" The answer is always yes for me. And so with Sherry, I thought about that question. Was she? I knew that she needed to be overbearing. I felt like you don't commit a murder on behalf of your daughter if you're just kind of really chill and laid back. I felt like this needed to be a story about control and enmeshment. And those are really the themes that I was interested in. And in some ways when I write, I don't really think about the question of representing. I don't feel like I have to create characters who are going to like not represent a stereotype or represent a stereotype or going to make the Jewish woman look good or look bad. I feel like that to me is sort of an external question that doesn't serve me as a writer. That my job as a novelist, I feel like, is to make the person feel real, to feel like they could exist. This woman could be real, and in some ways to unpack the question of, like the stereo. So if the stereotype is the overprotective mother, I feel like, wait, is that a bad thing to be over? Like, why do we assume it's a bad thing? Because of course the opposite is also a bad thing. The negligent mother is also bad. So, I feel like if we take as a given that you cannot win as a mother, and certainly as a Jewish mother, in some ways it creates this little path through it to say, I want to make this woman feel like a human, like to feel like she's alive, like there's a beating heart on the page. And I think the way to do it is to ask, what are those layers underneath? I felt like for Sherry, like it's easy to say, oh, she's overprotective, but much, much more interesting to say, not just, in a book, but in our lives, what is that about?
Mhm.
Why is someone overprotective? What is the fear? What are they afraid of? What are they trying to accomplish? What else is going on? And that to me is always the layer I'm interested in. I thought probably every single day I thought about a quote from Vivian Gornick, the great, memoirist who wrote that for the drama to deepen, you have to be willing to see the loneliness of the monster and the cunning of the victim. And that phrase, the loneliness of the monster, I feel like nothing has ever encapsulated so fully what I was interested in. And even the word loneliness, I felt like, that's the thing you're supposed to look for, not the sadness, not the pain, but loneliness to me is such a visceral experience. And I felt like for Sherry, I wanted to always find that loneliness or that wound. And I feel like once, as a writer, once I'm in touch with that wound or the loneliness, or then they're not a stereotype anymore. And so, of course, there's always that, I can't, one of the things I worried about, like, oh, it seems like a great time to put out a novel about like a Jewish woman who commits a murder. Like, oh, fun times all around. And I just had to go back to my own feeling of I'm writing about human beings. This is a woman who I feel could exist in the world, who I think does exist in the world in the weird way that, it's so close to, a real story. But to, you know, to be as close to them as I can, to be as close to their inner life as possible, and not just to react to, I don't want to be reactive to stereotypes. Like if the stereotype is that they're overprotective, then all my Jewish mothers are going to be very underprotective. I feel like in some ways I just have to let go of it. I don't know. I can't write with that worry all the time that this character, is going to be bad. And I worried it tremendously, of course. But I felt like I wanted her to have like the feeling, the richness of real to her.
Yeah, you feel her love and her kind of desperation and the claustrophobia of her, of her overbearingness. The other side of that, the mother-daughter duo is Haley, who is the daughter and is known in the book as kind of the nicest person in the world. There, she's sort of teased about that, and her nickname from her mom is Sunshine. And it was really interesting to see also that side of the drama of just like her trying to, figure out how much she wanted to be this close to her mom and when she wanted to separate. And it actually reminded me, I feel like the theme of the kind of the pressures of the good girl come up again and again in your writing. Um,
Wonder why.
yes, exactly. What a deep question.
So odd that how that is, right?
Yeah. Um, But one of the things I think that lurks under the surface in the book throughout is like whether she's going to erupt. They sort of joke about this, she and her brother. And that actually reminded me of what something you were saying earlier about it actually raises that question of like, what am I capable of? Like in many ways, I think that question about kind of sort of liberating the good girl, I often think of in those terms as sort of a liberation. And I think here you present that in some ways, but there's also this kind of darker side of it of like, what are you liberated potentially to do? Like, how scary could that be?
Right. The idea of the good girl was something that, I'm always interested in the good girl. If you've read my memoir, I don't have to explain to where it came from, but I was raised so much to be the good girl. I have it so viscerally in me, so hardwired to please, to be gentle, to not make waves. For me, I think writing my first novel, The Ladies Auxiliary, which was about my community in Memphis, which was the first time I ever had the experience of not being the good girl. It was this shock. It was just such a shock that, I felt like I was so soft-spoken and quiet, and yet I had written this book that people in Memphis were so upset about. And I think I always feel that push and pull. And there's the pleasure of being the good girl, of following the rules, of being inside. You know, you gain something from being the good girl, that sense of approval and belonging. And in my own life, I think leaving the Orthodox community that I was raised in and getting divorced and writing about it publicly was for me so much, I think, of a leave taking of any idea that I could still be that good girl. It feels like this splitting off of that possibility anymore. But it's still that complicated relationship to it. I know that I still have such a maybe still a longing to occupy that role. And so when I was thinking about Haley as a character, I thought, so much about that idea of the good girl. And in the same way with Sherry, I wanted to think about all the angles. I felt like, what does it feel like to have a mother? It's easy to say, oh, her mother is overbearing. She wants to break away. But it's always so much more complicated than that, because sometimes you want to break away and you want to stay at the same time. You want to be your own person, but you want to be like consumed in that love and that maternal love. And they exist at the same time. They're not mutually exclusive. And I think that's what so much of our inner conflicts come from, that the wish to have two things at once or to have it both. And so for Haley, in crafting her as a character, of course, I drew on some of my own good girl, stuff. But I also felt like I was interested in the question of, eruption, as you said, I don't want to spoil, I won't give this, I don't think this is a spoiler, but there's a question of to what degree she's involved in the story. And that, if you are a follower of the real true crime story, that is one of the main questions that really got me. And it was a question about whether Wendy Adelson, who is the woman who got divorced, was involved or not in this plot to kill her ex-husband. And I can't even tell you how much time I have devoted to trying to think about this. It's like one of the major, I would say, one of the top 5 conversations that Bruce, my husband, and I have to this day. Like at any given point, one of us can say, I really think I'm changing my mind. I think she did know. Just question, it's like it's a live question. And on one hand, could she not know? Could her mother and brother plot a murder behind her back? I mean, that felt shocking. But then, could she know? Could she participate in the murder of the father of her children? I mean, both feel impossible. Both are, yet one of them is true. And so that, it's the questions that kind of got me about the real story were the animating questions in writing the book. And so that question of, who is Haley? Is she good or is she not good? And what does it mean to be good? And can you be your own self and have boundaries and still be good? And the idea of eruption, I thought so much about the word escalation. I felt like I don't think anyone on day one, or maybe no one on day one of a divorce says, let's hire a hitman. I feel like that's like a later plan, like after things escalate and escalate more and more and more. And so for Haley too, that sense of she's pushed and pushed and pushed, and she pushes also. This is not like a one-way pushing. She does things she didn't think she would do. She finds that she's capable of getting angrier than she thought she ever could be. And to really play with those questions of what are we all capable of when we're pushed? and what happens when you sort of break out of that role that you've been assigned? Who might you be on the other side of that?
Yeah. And there's also a question of sort of like what the different emotions are. Like she gets angrier, and at one point her mom says to her like it's easier to be angry than to be sad, right? And so
Mhm.
um I think that that question of like what at what point do we allow ourselves to have certain emotions? At what point are certain emotions more like for some women it's very hard to be angry, but maybe in this case it was easier to tap into anger than
Right.
sadness in that respect.
Right. I remember feeling that in my own divorce. I remember feeling like anger kind of has like an energizing like fuel to it, like it's kind of like rocket fuel. Sadness is hard to sit in the sadness of something coming apart that you thought would be forever. I mean, it's so sad. It's sad, and that all the feelings that come with that. And so my divorce was nothing like this. No murder, it was like a normal.
Everyone lived through it. Yes.
Right, exactly. It was like a normal hard divorce. There was nothing like this even remotely, but I pulled, I think as a writer you're always pulling on things or borrowing things. And I think what I borrowed from my divorce was the way it's so unmooring, the way it can just it destabilizes who you are and what you imagine your life to be. And I think so much about divorce that I think is so interesting, or I don't know, if interesting or you know, gets me is I feel like it's almost a war of stories. Which story is true? Who's good and who's bad? Which version of the truth is the official version? Which not the truth? And that I feel like it's almost a war of reality. And I wanted to sort of make use of that in this, to pull that in for Haley, that feeling that you don't even know anymore, who's telling the truth or what is the truth anymore. Even the reality in so many ways breaks apart, and there's two sides to a story. And I think in so many ways, this whole book is really about, you get one side or you don't get both sides of the story. There's ways I tried to work in some of the husband Jonah story, but we never go into his point of view. And I thought about it in a divorce. It always depends on whose side you're willing to listen to. I've always been struck by if you ask two people who are getting divorced to each tell you their story, it's hard to believe they were even married to each other. They feel like totally separate stories. And that, that idea also is something that I just was very compelled by in writing the book.
Right. Well, there's the two stories of each side, and then there's also the pre-story and the post-story, right? There's the love story, and then there's the,
Mhm.
oh, it turns out that wasn't the real story. There's this other story that's not a love story. It's a lack of love or whatever it is.
And then does that undo or is the first story no longer true? Like, does it supplant that, or was that true then? And it has a surprise ending, and we each tell different versions of our own lives as time goes on, and people tell us versions about us. People have, divorce is one of those things that people who are not involved in the divorce have lots of opinions about, interestingly, which I've learned that the hard way. People who are not directly participating have feelings and opinions, and certainly in this divorce it's a divorce between a couple, but really it's a divorce in a family. And in the same way that people say, when you marry someone, you marry the whole family. I think when you get divorced, you often divorce the family. And certainly in the novel, Sherry feels that it feels personal because she's so enmeshed with her daughter and so intertwined. She feels her daughter's pain as if it's happening to her.
Yeah. I mean, and so much of the book is also in many ways about what it means to know something, right? Like here you're talking about the truth of different stories, but there's also just the question of like when we were talking about Haley, like does what would it mean to even know what her family was plotting? Because there's different ways of knowing. You can know something explicitly, but there also are all these other ways of knowing. And that's one of the issues in this family is that there's been a lot of, I don't know what the right word is, pretending or gaslighting or sort of like, not, creating one of Sherry's, I think, problematic characteristics is she wants to tell a story. She wants so much to believe that her family is perfect and special and particularly loving. And so she's constantly like saying that as if to make it real. And there's a question of like, what does it mean to know that that is not totally true or to know that that's not doesn't represent the whole reality? And what does it do when people refuse to know that? That's part of what leads to the break with the son, right? So like it's a complicated question.
Right, and I feel like with the characters, I feel for them. Sometimes I wonder, do I feel for these characters too much? But I really do. I feel like I know, like, I mean, we can all imagine that wish you want it to be so badly, want it to be a certain way. You want it to match the way it is in your head. You want, Sherry, more than anything, wants her family to be close to one another. She wants everyone to get along. She wants to feel like they're a special family, like they're a close family. And, on one hand, I can like skewer it, right? You could feel like she's delusional or she's blind. Yes, I think she is blind, and yet there's always the and yet. If you're willing to find that empathic side, I feel like, the part of me that, maybe because I lived with these characters for so long, or sometimes when I watch the real case, I think I'm a little too sympathetic. I'm like way inside their heads here. Like feel like they're my own people, but I feel like, they like, can I feel the pain? Like, can I feel the loss for Sherry that she feels like she has devoted her entire life to these children? She has worked a little bit in her husband's office, but they are her creations. She loves to garden and, grow these plants, but these are her plants. These are, she's tended to them and watered them. Now she's afraid that she might end up alone. And she has blind spots. I mean, of course, terrible blind spots. We all have blind spots. But to feel, I think for me, I wanted to feel the tragedy of her, the tragedy that she's in so badly wanting a closeness, she drives that closeness away. And I think, maybe I just, it's this, I try to write from the wound, from that sense of it, or to make myself feel, to feel empathy where I could. And then sometimes to pull back and be like, okay, this woman is about to murder somebody, or maybe murder, like maybe murder somebody, but to feel that sense of empathy.
Right. What are the boundaries of that? We have a question from Judy about the parallel of Sherry swimming to feel free and Haley running to feel free. Did you create that parallelism, or was that something that you pulled from the Adelson case?
I created that. I mean, who knows? Maybe they swim and run, but that came from me. So, it's a very good example of like where I feel like as a writer, it's like I always like you use what you have in the pantry. You use what you have access to. So um I have a very bad foot injury at the moment, so I'm not running right now. But in general, I spent the 5 years of writing this book running, and running became, I never thought I would be someone who runs. And I sort of started like a little bit, I ran like a mile here or there. And then over the pandemic and the years of running, I really started running longer distances. And I ran a few half marathons, and it felt thrilling. It felt like this sense of like this escape. And like, almost like you could be in your body and escape your body at the same time. And I think for me, running is this way of I think best when I run, and I have this feeling of, I run on the treadmill always, which is crazy. I don't really like enjoy. I should run outside, but the feeling that if as long as I'm on the treadmill, like nothing can find me. Like I can keep going. And so I first started, I decided to give Sherry that, but because the book is set so much in Florida, I decided to make her be a swimmer. But that same idea, I feel like the back and forth in the pool is me on the treadmill. That sense of thinking back and forth. And then for Haley, I later worked in the running, piece as well. But that sense of the urge to maybe to free yourself from your thoughts. Our thoughts sometimes do that same back and forth, and the wish almost to like escape from that kind of like rumination, and the way that um, for Sherry, the pool became this sort of like, I thought it was almost like this gestational place where like the ideas are hatched. And I loved writing about, in general, I loved writing about the swimming pool and about Florida, the Florida climate. I wrestled a lot with what to change from the real story and what to keep. Originally I was like, oh, they have to be dentists. I cannot possibly give up dentistry. I thought about like the sharp tools and like the cavities in their mouths and the cavities in their souls. I thought, like, oh, I have to. And then eventually I was like, you know what? I could get rid of that. So they're dermatologists, which is not that different. But Florida, I just couldn't get rid of Florida. I briefly toyed with the idea of setting the book in Memphis, where I grew up, but it just didn't feel like Memphis to me. I mean, I'm working on a new book right now set in Memphis, and I'm all, into the Memphis thing now, but I just felt like this was a book set in Florida. I feel like the hot, sticky, swampy feeling of Florida matched the kind of enmeshed, swampy family feelings. And one of my favorite things to Google, besides like how do you hire a hitman, was, beautiful West Palm Beach pools with gardens around them. And just like looking at these pictures and just trying to create that visual imagery for the book.
Yes, one set of search terms could get you arrested, the other could.
That other means that my feed is filled with like gardening tool
Right.
recommendations, things like that.
Um, so you mentioned that Jonah is treated a little bit differently as a character. He's the only one whose perspective we don't get to see. And I was curious why you chose to kind of leave him in a different area.
Right. Well, at first I felt that I was very much not trying to recreate the actual man, Dan Markel, who was murdered. I felt like I did not want to sort of take him as a character and, import him into my book. I felt like I wanted distance from him with a sense that this is a real person. I did not want to try to recreate him. I know many people, as I know you do, who knew him, who, when they heard what I was writing about, asked if I wanted to talk to them about him. And I wasn't interested in sort of creating him. I really, in so many ways, tried to create a character as if very different from him in many ways. Some of the choices were like, oh, I kind of knew he was like this. He's going to be the opposite. Like to really pull away from feeling like I was writing about a real person who had suffered a tragedy, who I did not want to be writing about. But I wrestled with that question of, like the point of view, there's always the thing of whose point of view are we going to go into? Is this book going to be a multiple point of view book? Are we going to be in the first person? Am I going to rotate between the different characters? And I felt really strongly that it was a family drama. For all that I've heard, it's a thriller, which I get annoyed about when I hear that. I feel like it's a family story. It's about a family, and I wanted it to have almost like a suffocating, intense family feel to it. And I wrote a lot of from Jonah's point of view. I have like pages and pages, like files I write just for myself, like his side of the story. And I felt like it made it seem like a he said, she said, like his version, her version. And it got away from sort of the intensity, the family drama. If there's the only non-family member whose point of view you get is Tara, who's a secretary in the office. And I needed her perspective in there for some plot reasons, but I really did not want to have them in there. There used to be many more chapters, and I scaled them back as much as I can. Those were my least favorite ones to write and my least favorite chapters in general, just because I felt like I was like, okay, there was sort of a plot logistic question that had to be solved by her point of view, and I felt like she shed some light on the family. It kind of gave you a little bit of an outsider's perspective on them, but I decided not to have his point of view. But then I knew that was in some ways it's unfair, right? I mean, the character, if you have two friends who are going through a divorce and you only hear his side, you are going to only feel sympathy in that way. And I thought about that in terms of that you weren't going to get Jonah's point of view and what was that going to do to his sympathy. And so I kept playing with this sort of seesaw of sympathy. I felt like were there ways for me to make you aware as a reader that you were not getting the whole story. You were getting one side of the story. And one of the places there were two places I tried to do that. One was in the funeral, where Sherry attends Jonah's funeral and she hears, all of his friends talk about what a great person he is and how wonderful he is. And it's that strange feeling of like, I mean, it's just a very, I think, moment we have. You feel like people see others so differently. Like, I don't like this person, and yet you love them. Or like, oh, I think this person's great, and you don't. Like, how could that be? And even Sherry has the realization, almost like there's two Jonahs, like there's two versions. And some of it, I think, is that we're different ways with different people. We're not the same all the time. People we really like, we can be generous to, and people we don't like, we can be very cold to. And so I wanted to sort of open up the perspective. And then in the book has two threads. There's sort of the family story, and then there's the second thread of the book that takes place in Maine, which felt to me like the opposite of West Palm Beach, Florida, which takes place a year or so after most of the events of the novel, where there's some reflection. It's narrated by Haley, and there's reflection on those characters, on what's happened, and some moment where she starts to wonder, what would happen if she could see some of this from Jonah's point of view? I think in any kind of disagreement, certainly in a divorce, we cling to our side of the story so vehemently. Like if we let go of our version, it feels like we could drown if we don't cling to it. And Haley has that realization where she just wonders, what would happen if I saw it from his point of view, or I acknowledged that there's another point of view that could exist next to mine? And so those were ways to sort of get around the problem of not having Jonah's point of view directly in the book.
Well, I'm glad that you brought up that later timeline that takes place in Maine because it was a really interesting way to have the structure and it gives you, I can see like that way to sort of look back and for Haley to look back and reflect outside of the initial drama. Um, but it also introduces kind of other elements, for example, dogs.
As my dog is lying right behind, I just heard him
Right.
pitter patter up.
My dog has settled down, is over here. But I feel like since my dog decided to make a brief appearance today, we should talk about that
Oh,
piece. Especially because I know you were not a dog person when you started this book. So how did that part of the plot enter for you?
so it's certain things in the book I feel like, I'm in like deep in writing a new book, and I feel like I'm certain things I feel like I know, and certain things I'm like going in search of. I feel like I have to figure this out. And with this book, there were things I knew right away and things I had to go look for. And one of the things I knew right away, I thought there's gonna be two threads, it's gonna be a later thread. And just very early on, I was like, and there are gonna be dogs in that thread. It was just like, okay, like one of these thoughts that like come into my mind as I'm driving or running or whatever. And I thought, oh, but interesting. The brother who's estranged is gonna move away from the family and live in Maine. And he's gonna have this like dog sanctuary. And I was just like, okay, that's interesting. But I always think, no, that's ridiculous. I'm not writing about dogs. And then the thought comes back again and again and again. And then I pay attention. And I was like, you know what? Dogs, okay, clearly there's a dog part. And I actually thought, I'm not a dog person, but I'm going to read a lot of books about dogs. And my stepson has two dogs. The first time my stepson brought the dogs to our house, I was like, he wants to bring the dogs inside our house. Like he's like into the house. I was like shocked by this idea that the dogs could come stay with us. It was just like, it's like, wow, this is really crazy. And so I was going to sort of observe those dogs. I was going to read about dogs. But I felt like dogs, I think the reason I got interested in dogs was because I remember hearing something about dogs, like how even a gentle dog after they have a baby could attack, could become aggressive if they felt like, their babies were in danger in any way. And I felt like the idea of that what animals will do when they're trapped or when they're trying to protect. And in some ways, I felt like the real story, felt like an animal story. I mean, is out of an urge to protect or the feeling entrapped, they attacked. I was sort of thinking about like animal kingdom references. And so I started down this dog path, reading. I read like all these books about like, do dogs have feelings? And what is your dog really thinking? Meanwhile, like thinking I'm not going to ever have a dog. And then probably like a week or two after the JWA thing, like the March, last week in March, my daughter came downstairs. It was one of the very bad days of the pandemic when like it started to become clear this is not like a 2 week activity, and had this picture and said, "This is the dog of my heart." And I was like, oh, and I was like, if I could love a dog, that would be the kind of dog I could love, like a little furry dog. And before I knew it, I was like, not a dog. I'm a dog person, but I'm like a kid person. I was like, anything to like please or like to take away the anxiety, anything to help make it better. And so before I knew it, we had this little dog who was very sweet, but was 3 pounds and vomiting nonstop for like a whole summer and very, very sick. And I had this moment of realizing like I'm responsible for this dog. Like I might not be a dog person, but I have to take this dropper of medicine and put it in his mouth, every 3 hours. And I would rock him at night because he would whimper and was so, so sick. And, I fell in love with the dog. It's like, and I felt this sense that I was the dog's mother, like in this really visceral way, because of caretaking, that I was in charge of taking care of this dog. And it changed me. I mean, it's so funny. He had him he's gonna be 5 next week. Of course, we know his birthday and are planning a birthday celebration, which means exactly what kind of dog mom I have become. And then I ended up writing so much of the book with the dog on my lap. But I felt like it gave me another lens to think about mother-child relationships, because there is a scene in the book where a dog gives birth, and to think about, I think, caretaking in so many ways, and mothering, and the different ways of mothering, and the different ways of, I think, maybe of giving love and receiving love, and the way so they're sort of fitting dogs into those sort of questions. And so The dog parts are probably my favorite parts to write about the book. I would like look at my dog and be like, okay, I'm going to describe that. Like he does this head tilt. Let me describe that. But it became a way to think about, so much of the book is about connection to the family connections and dynamics. And for Adam, the character who is estranged from the family, the dogs become a way to connect and become his most important form of connection and relationship. And so I just was able to make use of that. And I got to watch so many great videos of dogs giving birth. I was like, what is the word for that thing that I'm seeing? Like, what adjective would you use to describe that? The way this looks. But that was, I mean, just watching so many videos of dogs giving birth was a hobby.
Yeah, that's an unexpected part of research.
Yeah, exactly.
Becca's asking if you ever dream about the characters that you've created.
Definitely. There's that sense. I have two kinds of writer dreams. One is the characters. One is they just feel real. There's just so much time spent. And maybe this book more than any because I think both because they were based on real people in such a specific way, and because I wrote so much of it during the pandemic, where I spent so much time in this, holed up in this spot. The kids were in Zoom school or, everyone was home, but I would come in here and just felt like we couldn't go anywhere, but I could go into these characters. So I had that kind of dream. And then late in the game, I always have a different kind of dream. I've had it with every book. I have dreams of pages. It's so weird. I dream like I see the pages, I see my edits, like this sort of like maybe it's like an anxiety dream about like, did I miss a comma? Did I miss a word? But just that the sense of the book as a physical form. And it's now like at the big, I'm just, being at the start of a new project. I feel like sometimes I try to think about them before I fall asleep. I sometimes try to like summon the characters. I want to dream about them. I feel like maybe it'll help, almost like unlock them or make them feel real. And um, but there's such a sense of writing a book is such an involved process of really inhabiting characters and language and structure questions and plot. It's just such a long process that it feels like I feel like I'm always thinking about it, like whether I'm asleep or whatever I'm doing, they're always sort of there.
Mm. Have you ever had experiences where the characters from different books that you've written interact, like a crossover episode?
Right, exactly. I'll bring back Batsheva, it's funny they don't. I feel like there's some way in which after maybe a year or so after a book comes out or after I'm really deeply involved in the new one, I almost never think about the old books. It's really funny how maybe like one part of my mind shuts down and there's no space. I did a Zoom recently for a book club that had read Ladies Auxiliary and it came out 25 years ago and they were asking me like very specific plot questions, and I was like, "Wait, could you just remind me?" I'm like, "What happened?"
I know I wrote this book, but what
Could not
happened?
remember. I remember like the big picture themes, but like a plot point, I was like, "Oh, I don't know." And it's such a strange feeling to realize. I mean, first of all, so many years have gone by, but also that in some ways it's almost like the intensity of writing the book and then there's the publication period which is its own sort of different sort of intensity of talking about the book or experiencing it not as my own private creation but as something that I discuss with people and then there's like the return to that like hold up kind of place of trying to just be inside a book, like trying to like make it feel real. And I mean, I love that part I don't love the part I'm in right now where it's like trying to fight my way into it, but I love that feeling of, being so immersed where I would dream about it or when I feel like, close my eyes and I'm in that world. But that, I'm sort of writing right now towards that stage, which I look forward to being at, hopefully not too far off.
Well, that was going to be my last question to you. Can you give us a little hint about what you're working on now?
Sure. And it's funny, Judith, when you were describing the mission of JWA, I was like, I need to ask Judith many questions because so I am writing, after every book I've written, I've always said that I wanted to write a several generations Southern Jewish novel using my family history. And I always get waylaid after every book, I've sort of veered off. I start it, I write pages and pages, and then I end up writing a different book. And it's happened after each book. And it is not going to happen this time. I decided if I don't do it now, I feel like I'm not going to do it. And so I'm really interested in my family history. My family's been in Memphis since 1873, but I'm particularly interested in my great grandmother who came to Memphis in 1921. She was a late arriver, and she was from Grodno, Poland, and her Yiddish name was Gittel. I'm named after her, where Gittel means good, which is what Tova means in Hebrew. And I really know one story about her. She was in Grodno one day and went digging for potatoes, and her shoes were stolen. It's just this like little story, and my grandmother used to tell it, and my grandmother told it as this coming of age, coming to America story. And then my mother used to tell it as a fairy tale. She wanted to write a children's book with like little black shoes flying with wings behind a little girl, like a little Red Riding Hood. And then my mother and I started doing some family research for a variety of reasons. And this great grandmother's brother was actually still alive, and my mother asked him if he remembered this potato story. And he was a little strange about it. And then he finally said that yes, he did remember the story, and he was there when it happened, and he hid under the porch the whole time.
Mm.
All of a sudden, the story, right? It's not a little fairy tale. It's not Little Red Riding Hood with a little basket of potatoes. This story changes dramatically. And so I've written a few short stories. They're all called Potatoes, which is what the novel is also called right now. But I became really interested in what was the story, what was not being told as we were telling it, this constant telling the story, leaving out, and how no one asked. No one said, what happened next, but no questions were asked. And I ended up doing some research about what 1921 Grodno was like. I initially thought, oh, it's after World War One, like it's probably a peaceful time. It was not a peaceful time. 1921 on the Russian-Polish borderline was a time of immense pogroms, and the Polish Bolshevik War. And so I just I started, so I'm interested so using that story. And I also recently read a book about rape in the pogroms and did not know the degree of the prevalence of rape in the pogroms. And one of the sentences in this book is by Irina Askatevich. I think I might be messing up her last name, but she talked about how in the interviews with women after pogroms, a lot of the women would recount sort of leading up to a rape, and then they would skip what happened, and then they would recount their material losses. And she said they would talk about the jewelry, furnishings, and shoes. And
Mm.
I just felt like, oh, like there's that's, like that sense of, of course, I don't know what really happened. And so much of the book is about that question of what are the stories we pass down and what stories we tell and what we don't tell when we tell them. So right now it's just a series of like, and on my computer, potatoes one, new potatoes one, potatoes two, potatoes three, but just potatoes, potatoes, potatoes everywhere. But
Reminds me of that Yiddish song about potatoes.
yeah, I love that song exactly. But just that, so that is, there's three strands. I have a whole, you know, files and outlines, but it feels really good to be working on it. It feels to me like this is the book that I am meant to be writing, and just using I think for so long I've collected this family history and thought about it, and it feels exciting to be at the stage right now. Maybe I wasn't ready to write it before, but feel ready to write it now.
Well, we look forward to having you back in 5 years or sooner, whenever that book is done.
Or 10,
And
you never know.
right, no, knowing you, um,
10. Right.
to discuss that book. But thank you so much, Tova, for this conversation
Thank
tonight,
you.
and for
Thank
your
you so
book,
much.
and to
Thank
everyone
you all for coming. Thank you so
being here with
much.
us. Betsy, if you could, I see you've sent the links I'm about to mention, but send them to everyone, please, because I think they're just to the host and panelists. As I always say, there's always more to discover at JWA. You can watch that very first JWA Book Talk, which was then called the Quarantine Book Club uh, with Tova and Rachel Kadish. We have that link for you. Um, on Jewish Women Amplified, our online publication, you can read an essay that Tova wrote about writing her memoir, The Book of Separation, and another piece that she wrote for us about grappling with Southern history during a Passover she spent in Charleston, South Carolina. Um, you can learn more about Tova and other 21st century Jewish American writers in our encyclopedia article on 21st century Jewish literature by women in the US. And there's much more. So explore away. Please join us next week, same time, same place, for a conversation with Ruth Franklin about her book, The Many Lives of Anne Frank. Um, and until then, until next time, wishing you a very good week. Take care of yourselves, take care of each other, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.
Thank you.